This is a CNN News 18 exclusive. The Tibetans are reportedly upset with the Chinese government for increasing surveillance during the Losar festival. Now, sources tell CNN News 18 that agencies are coming and searching houses, and facial profiling is also being conducted. The police is also guarding areas with a close proximity as they fear protests by locals against the government. The Tibetans also feel that this is an attack on their freedom, and the Chinese government wants to contain them, and ultimately they will be converted to camps like what's taking place with the Uyghurs.
China is one country that has been known to be engaged in numerous territorial disputes with its nearby countries. Many of the borders between China and Pakistan, Taiwan, and India are still the subject of ongoing legal disputes. In this video, our main focus is the conflict and dispute between China and Tibet. These two countries have been at odds ever since China invaded Tibet in 1950, and now the plight of Tibet is one that is among the saddest in modern history. It is a tale of oppression and the brutal annexation of the entire country by the Chinese Communist Party. China claims to have sovereignty over Tibet, whereas Tibet claims it does not. This brings us to the tough question: does Tibet belong to China? And why does China think it owns Tibet? Well, the question of Tibet being part of China is complicated, and it is not a straightforward answer to say that Tibet is currently regarded legally as an autonomous region of China. But just in case you're not familiar, Tibet, a region bordered by India, Nepal, Myanmar, and Bhutan, is situated to the southwest of China, and Tibet is a region that had long held a distinct culture, religion, and language before the invasion of China in 1950. Today, the widespread Chinese immigration and tight controls on all manifestations of Tibetan culture and national identity pose a threat to this culture. To better understand the Tibet-China conflict, let's take it down to the history of this dispute and why China thinks it owns Tibet. China's aggression in Tibet dates back to the 1950s when China invaded Tibet. But before this invasion in 1950, Tibet had a distinctive culture, religion, language, and political system for centuries. Tibet's political and spiritual leader, the 13th Dalai Lama, declared in 1913 that Tibet was a small, religious, and independent nation in a proclamation that reaffirmed Tibet's independence. The nation signed international treaties, upheld diplomatic ties with its neighbors, and had its own national anthem, flag, currency, stamps, and army. In fact, Tibet established a foreign office in 1942 in response to the politics that took place during World War II. After the war was over, Tibet even sent congratulatory missions to China and India. While on the mission to China, a letter was written to Chiang Kai-shek, the president of the People's Republic of China at the time, claiming Tibetan independence. Then, in 1946, a Tibetan delegation traveled to Nanking, China, to attend the National Constitutional Assembly as an observer. Meanwhile, during the assembly, the Chinese Kuomintang government declared in a resolution, all the people of the countries whose delegates are present at the assembly are now subjects of the Chinese Kuomintang government. Following that, the Chinese government then deceived and coerced Tibet delegates into a constitutional agreement that they had no authority to commit to. Who knew what the Chinese government was cooking up? In 1950, the newly established Chinese Communist regime decided that Tibet had to become a permanent part of the People's Republic of China and launched an invasion. From the perspective of Tibet, this invasion ended centuries of independent nationhood. Meanwhile, the Chinese believed that they were simply regaining control of a portion of their sovereign territory that had been wrested from them by foreign imperialism over the previous century, sparking a civil war. Following the invasion in 1951, the Tibetan government, led by the Dalai Lama, was forced to recognize Chinese rule in exchange for promises to protect Tibet's political system and Tibetan Buddhism. Yes, the Chinese government imposed the so-called 17-point agreement for Tibet's peaceful liberation on the Tibetan government. Talking about peaceful liberation. Liberation from what exactly? Who knows? Anyways, because the agreement was signed under duress, this agreement was deemed void under international law. I mean, given the presence of 40,000 troops in Tibet, the threat of an immediate takeover of Lhasa and the possibility of total destruction of the Tibetan state, there was little the Tibetans could do. Now, talking about the 17-point agreement that Tibet was forced to agree to, it is important to note that the constitutional agreement in the 1946 National Constitutional Assembly should not be confused with the 17-point agreement. The 17-point agreement has remained China's position on the legal binding that justifies rule over Tibet. China broke its promises, and the ongoing Tibetan resistance came to its peak on March 10, 1959. By 1959, a popular uprising resulted in a massive protest by Tibetans to oppose the Chinese occupation of their homeland. And when people demonstrate like this within other countries, it means there is a problem that requires a peaceful solution. However, the Chinese government, on the other hand, saw it as a challenge they couldn't bear, and their solution, death. The Chinese Communist Party retaliated with ruthless repression, effectively subjugating Tibet and taking the first steps towards full colonization of the region. The uprising was suppressed to the point that it resulted in the deaths of 87,000 Tibetans and the forced exile of the Dalai Lama, Tibet's spiritual and political leader. Since then, the Chinese government has exercised complete political control over Tibet, dissuading and punishing Tibetan opposition with all available means. Sadly, the US think tank Freedom House has ranked Tibet as one of the worst places in the world for civil rights and political freedom for the past 6 years in a row. Under the Chinese Communist Party, nobody is free. Tibetans, however, have fewer civil and political rights than most people. Every day, the Chinese government subjects Tibetans to suffocating control and the use of violence, from mass police surveillance of the Lhasa's busy streets to torture in Tibet's hidden detention centers. Every aspect of Tibetan life is being attacked. Dissent, protest, or even wishing the Dalai Lama a happy birthday or carrying a Tibetan flag on your phone will land you in jail. In fact, Tibetans must censor themselves in order to avoid imprisonment. This is heartbreaking. So, what is the result of years of imposed Chinese rules and brutality? Has Tibet finally given in? Well, no, they haven't. Tibetans have never stopped resisting the occupation since the Chinese Communist Party invaded in 1950. Tibetans, despite over 70 years of occupation, resist China's policies on a daily basis, from shouting, "Tibet needs freedom," in the streets to participating in a mass protest. Over 1.2 million Tibetans have died as a result of CCP brutality. To put into perspective, that equates to 1 out of every 6 Tibetans. Consider the level of cruelty. Today, the struggle is more difficult than ever, as the Chinese government employs ever more advanced technology and increasingly brutal tactics to suppress dissent. A new generation of Tibetans, whose parents and grandparents do not remember a life free of Chinese rule, are fighting back. The Tibetan culture, religion, and language are being eroded to the point of extinction as the CCP attempts to maintain its iron grip on Tibet, controlling both the region's vast resources and its people. Tibetans protest to fight back against the tide of sinicization, from environmental exploitation and nomadic displacement to religious restrictions and oppressive policing. The Tibetan people risk their personal safety and freedom to ensure their voices are heard. While the messages of each protest differ, some demands remain constant. Tibetans have repeatedly demanded the protection of Tibetan identity, self-determination, human rights, and the return of the Dalai Lama to Tibet. As heartbreaking as it is, the sad reality is that if nothing changes, if an intervention does not occur, there will be a lot more deaths. The fact is, from a legal perspective, Tibet has not lost its statehood. According to international law, it is an independent state that is under illegal occupation, a fact that China wishes it could erase from history. While Tibet was never a modern nation-state, Tibet has upheld a distinct culture, written and spoken language, religion, and political system for centuries. Tibet has influenced and has been influenced by several foreign powers over the course of its long history, including Britain, the Mongols, and China. In any case, the Chinese government justifies their occupation by claiming that Tibet has been a part of China for 800 years. Neither China's military invasion nor the illegal occupation of Tibet has transferred sovereignty of Tibet to China. The international community is aware of the severe atrocities perpetrated against Tibet, but due to China's clout, this has been regarded as a domestic issue. However, the truth remains that no country wants to put itself at risk of being stung by the Chinese economic machine. As a result, Tibet is still suffering. What are your thoughts about the ongoing issue between China and Tibet? Feel free to share in the comments. Please like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching. Bye.